Saint Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430 AD, is one of the most influential figures in the history of Western thought. His theological insights, philosophical contributions, and autobiographical innovations reshaped Christianity, philosophy, education, and even the understanding of the self. His synthesis of classical philosophy with Christian doctrine provided the foundation upon which much of medieval, Renaissance, and even modern Western thinking was built. This article explores how St. Augustine revolutionized key areas of Western thought, including the nature of the self, time and memory, original sin, the church and state, education, love and desire, and the philosophy of history. One of Augustine's most groundbreaking contributions was his development of a deep psychological introspection that laid the groundwork for modern conceptions of the self. In his Confessions, considered the first Western autobiography, Augustine pioneered a radically new way of thinking by turning inward. Rather than understanding truth merely through empirical observation or abstract reasoning, Augustine emphasized the importance of the inner life: memory, will, desire, guilt, and self-reflection. Augustine wrote, "Do not go outward, return within yourself. In the inward man dwells truth." This was a revolutionary departure from the classical Greek focus on the external cosmos. While Plato and Aristotle discussed the soul, Augustine gave interiority a central role in epistemology and spiritual growth. His meditations on memory, its layers, functions, and role in identity, also anticipate modern cognitive psychology. He described memory as a vast court containing images, ideas, and emotions, and believed that the journey to God begins within. This interior turn profoundly influenced later thinkers such as Descartes, who began his philosophy with self-consciousness, "I think, therefore I am," and shaped the Western emphasis on individuality and subjectivity. Perhaps no doctrine associated with Augustine has had more enduring impact than that of original sin. Drawing on his debates with Pelagius, a British monk who denied humanity's inherited sinfulness, Augustine argued that all humans inherit the guilt and consequences of Adam's fall. This had sweeping implications for anthropology, ethics, and theology. In contrast to the classical view that humans are naturally rational and virtuous, Augustine argued that the human will is fundamentally disordered. This libido dominandi, the lust to dominate, corrupts relationships, institutions, and societies. Augustine's emphasis on humanity's fallen condition underscored the necessity of grace for salvation. This idea shaped medieval theology and became a central point of contention during the Reformation. Luther and Calvin both drew deeply from Augustinian thought on grace and depravity. In the long arc of Western thought, Augustine's doctrine of original sin replaced classical optimism with a tragic realism about human nature that continues to inform theology, psychology, and even political theory. Augustine's reflections on grace and free will created a theological tension that persists to this day. In his early writings, he emphasized human freedom and moral responsibility. But after his dispute with Pelagius, he leaned heavily on the primacy of divine grace. According to Augustine, humans cannot choose good on their own. It is God's grace that enables the will to be free. This nuanced interaction between grace and freedom shaped Catholic and Protestant soteriology for centuries. The concept of prevenient grace, grace that precedes human decision, and the later debates on predestination trace directly back to Augustine. Augustine thus introduced a complex, non-deterministic view of the human condition. We are free, yet radically dependent on divine help, a paradox that continues to challenge theologians and philosophers. In The City of God, Augustine articulated a political theology that shaped Western political thought for over a millennium. Responding to the sack of Rome in 410 AD and the crumbling Roman Empire, Augustine proposed that human history unfolds between two symbolic cities: the city of man, rooted in self-love and temporal power, and the city of God, rooted in love of God and eternal truth. These two cities are intermingled in history, but ultimately have different ends. One passes away, the other endures forever. Augustine's distinction between the sacred and the secular became foundational to the later development of the separation between church and state. He also introduced the idea that the state, while flawed, can serve God's purposes in restraining evil and maintaining order. This concept laid the groundwork for medieval theories of just war, the divine right of kings, and eventually modern secular political theory. In Book the Seventh of Confessions, Augustine undertook a profound exploration of time, an inquiry that would influence philosophers from Boethius to Heidegger. He distinguished between chronos, measurable, earthly time, and kairos, God's eternal now, emphasizing that God exists outside of time while humans live within it. He argued that the past exists in memory, the future in expectation, and the present in attention. Time, for Augustine, is not an objective feature of the world, but a property of the human soul. His theory of time was centuries ahead of its era, prefiguring psychological theories of temporal perception and even influencing Einstein's concept of time as relative. Moreover, Augustine introduced the idea of a linear history with a beginning, a direction, and a culmination, departing from the cyclical views of history common in antiquity. Augustine's anthropology is centered on desire. His famous line, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you," captures his entire vision of the human condition. All human longing, according to Augustine, is ultimately a longing for God. This had deep ethical and spiritual implications. For Augustine, sin is not desire per se, but disordered love, ordo amoris, loving lesser things more than the ultimate good. This concept would permeate the Christian moral tradition and shape later thinkers such as Aquinas and Dante. Augustine's insight that even sin is a misdirected desire for the good introduces a nuanced psychology of motivation that avoids simplistic dichotomies of good versus evil. It also points to a redemptive path. Healing comes through reordering one's loves toward God. One of Augustine's most enduring legacies was his synthesis of faith and reason. Influenced by Neoplatonism, particularly Plotinus, Augustine affirmed that human reason is a gift from God and can lead to truth, but it must be illuminated by faith. His famous dictum, "I believe in order to understand, and I understand in order to believe," expresses a dialectical relationship between faith and reason that would become foundational for the scholastics, especially Anselm and Aquinas. Unlike Tertullian, who questioned the value of Greek philosophy in Christian life, Augustine believed that plundering the Egyptians, using pagan wisdom for Christian purposes, was not only permissible, but vital. He preserved and Christianized the legacy of Plato, ensuring its transmission into the medieval world. Augustine had a profound impact on the development of Christian education and the liberal arts. Before his conversion, he was a professor of rhetoric steeped in classical learning. After his conversion, he reinterpreted the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, not as ends in themselves, but as tools to ascend toward divine truth. In On Christian Doctrine, Augustine proposed that Scripture should be studied with the same rigor as classical texts, emphasizing both literal and allegorical interpretation. He also insisted that knowledge must be used in service of love, a radical reorientation of education's purpose. His view of education as formative of the whole person, mind, heart, and soul, resonates through Catholic intellectual traditions and liberal arts institutions to this day. Augustine's views on the body and soul were complex. Influenced by Manichaean and Neoplatonic dualism, he initially saw the body as inferior to the soul. However, after his Christian conversion, he adopted a more integrated view. The body is good, created by God, but it suffers from the consequences of the fall. His theology of the resurrection affirms the goodness of the body and its future redemption. Yet Augustine retained a strong suspicion of bodily appetites, especially in regard to sexuality, which he saw as a site of intense disorder post-fall. His teachings influenced Christian sexual ethics, views on concupiscence, and celibacy for centuries. While often criticized for his rigidity, his honesty about the power of bodily desire and the need for grace has continued to resonate in debates about human embodiment. St. Augustine's influence can hardly be overstated. He provided the intellectual architecture for medieval Christianity and inspired generations of theologians, philosophers, and reformers. His impact on theology, from Anselm and Aquinas to Luther and Calvin, Augustine's doctrines on grace, sin, and salvation defined theological debates for over a millennium. Philosophy, existentialists like Kierkegaard and phenomenologists like Heidegger drew on Augustine's introspective method. Charles Taylor and Alasdair MacIntyre continue to engage with his work. Literature and the arts. Augustine's Confessions set the precedent for autobiographical literature. His personal narrative of conversion inspired later works by Rousseau, Tolstoy, and even Freud. Politics. Augustine's City of God provided the blueprint for Christian engagement with the political realm and continues to inform Christian political theory. Augustine lived at a turning point in history. The Roman world was collapsing, and Christianity was transitioning from a persecuted faith to a cultural cornerstone. In this time of upheaval, he preserved the intellectual treasures of antiquity while simultaneously transforming them. He bridged the classical and Christian worlds, sowing the seeds for medieval thought, humanist introspection, and modern individualism. By probing the depths of the human heart, reconciling faith with reason, and laying a theological foundation for Western civilization, St. Augustine became not just a saint, but a father of the Western mind. His restless heart reshaped how the West thinks about God, the self, and the meaning of life.